In the shadow of Jerusalem's ancient walls, beneath layers of sand and centuries of silence, lies a truth that history textbooks dare not tell. They were called many names: the Order of St. John, the Knights of Rhodes, the Knights of Malta. But to those who truly knew them, they were something far more dangerous than mere crusading monks. They were the Hospitallers, and their story is not the sanitized tale of charity and healing that echoes through monastery halls today. Picture this: warrior monks who built hospitals by day and planned assassinations by night. Men who took vows of poverty while amassing wealth that rivaled entire kingdoms. Healers who could mend a broken bone with one hand and break a neck with the other. For nearly 9 centuries, they have walked the razor's edge between salvation and damnation, between the sacred and the profane. Tonight, we're going to peel back the layers of pious propaganda and reveal what the Knights Hospitaller really were. Not just the charitable order your history teacher mentioned in passing, but a shadow empire that shaped the destiny of nations, toppled governments, and wrote their legacy in blood across 3 continents. Have you ever wondered why an order supposedly dedicated to caring for sick pilgrims needed the most advanced military fortifications of their time? Why did monks require spy networks that stretched from London to Constantinople? And why, even today, do certain archives remain sealed, certain documents classified, certain truths buried beneath the weight of 800 years of silence? The rabbit hole goes deeper than you think, much deeper, because what we're about to uncover isn't just the story of medieval knights playing dress-up in white crosses and black robes. This is the chronicle of perhaps history's most successful secret organization, one that survived the fall of the Roman Empire, outlasted the Crusades, weathered the Reformation, and somehow managed to reinvent itself for every new age, while keeping its true nature hidden from prying eyes. From the blood-soaked streets of Jerusalem to the siege-torn walls of Rhodes, from the fortress island of Malta to the shadow corridors of modern European capitals, the Hospitallers have been there, watching, waiting, acting when the moment was right. And if you think their story ended centuries ago, you haven't been paying attention. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let's start where every good mystery begins, with a lie that everyone believes. The year was 1048, and Jerusalem was a city of contradictions. Christian pilgrims trudged through streets controlled by Muslim rulers, seeking salvation in a land that belonged to neither. It was here, in this crucible of faith and commerce, that a group of Italian merchants supposedly founded a hospital to care for sick travelers. A simple act of charity, the history books tell us. Nothing more than good Christians doing God's work. Except that's not how it happened at all. The real story begins not with merchants, but with a man whose name has been deliberately obscured by centuries of careful editing. Brother Gerard, they called him, though his true identity remains one of history's most closely guarded secrets. Was he French? Italian? Some whisper he might have been something else entirely, a man whose origins were so sensitive that even today, certain Vatican archives refuse to release documents bearing his seal. What we do know is this: Gerard didn't just build a hospital, he built a network. By the time the First Crusade reached Jerusalem's gates in 1099, his so-called charitable institution had already established connections with merchants, nobles, and information brokers from Amalfi to Antioch. The hospital was never just about healing bodies. It was about gathering intelligence, moving money, and positioning the order at the very center of medieval Europe's most lucrative trade routes. Think about it logically. Why would a small group of monks caring for pilgrims need papal protection? Why would they require exemption from local taxes and laws? Why would kings and emperors shower them with donations that would make modern billionaires jealous? The answer is simple: because they were never just monks. From the very beginning, the Hospitallers understood something that their contemporaries missed. In an age where information traveled at the speed of horseback, whoever controlled the flow of people, goods, and secrets controlled everything. Pilgrims weren't just souls seeking salvation, they were mobile intelligence assets. Merchants weren't just traders, they were money launderers and covert operatives. And hospitals weren't just places of healing, they were the perfect cover for activities that couldn't be conducted in the light of day. By 1113, when Pope Paschal II officially recognized the order, the Hospitallers had already evolved far beyond their charitable origins. Their hospitals stretched across the Holy Land, but more importantly, their influence had begun to seep into the power structures of Europe itself. They weren't just taking care of sick pilgrims anymore. They were making and breaking alliances, financing wars, and quietly accumulating the kind of power that makes kings nervous. And then came the moment that changed everything. It was 1120, and the delicate balance of power in the Crusader states was beginning to shift. The initial euphoria of conquest had faded, replaced by the harsh realities of governing hostile territories thousands of miles from home. The Crusader kingdoms needed more than just prayers and charity. They needed professional soldiers, sophisticated intelligence networks, and most crucially, they needed money. Lots of it. This is where the genius of the Hospitallers becomes apparent. While other military orders focused purely on warfare, the Hospitallers maintained their dual identity. They could tend to a wounded crusader in the morning and plan a covert operation against Saracen supply lines in the afternoon. They could negotiate trade agreements with Muslim merchants while simultaneously gathering intelligence for Christian armies. They became indispensable, not because they were the best fighters, though they were formidable, but because they were the most versatile. Their hospitals became more than medical facilities. They became intelligence hubs, financial centers, and diplomatic meeting grounds. When a Muslim envoy needed to communicate with Crusader leadership, he often did so through Hospitaller intermediaries. When European nobles needed to transfer vast sums of money across dangerous territories, they used Hospitaller banking networks. When sensitive negotiations required absolute secrecy, they took place in Hospitaller chapter houses. But perhaps most importantly, the Hospitallers began to master something that would define their operations for centuries to come: the art of playing all sides while serving only themselves. Consider the siege of Ascalon in 1153. While the Templars and other military orders threw themselves into direct assault, the Hospitallers took a different approach. They established field hospitals that treated wounded soldiers from both Christian and Muslim armies. They negotiated prisoner exchanges. They facilitated communications between opposing commanders. To outside observers, they appeared to be neutral humanitarian actors. In reality, they were gathering intelligence from all parties, identifying potential defectors, and positioning themselves to profit regardless of who won. This pattern would repeat itself countless times over the following decades. The Hospitallers developed an almost supernatural ability to emerge from conflicts not just intact, but stronger than before. While other orders bled themselves white in futile battles, the Hospitallers grew richer, more influential, and more indispensable to everyone who mattered. Their secret was simple yet brilliant. They understood that in a world defined by religious warfare, the most powerful position was not that of the most devout believer, but of the most useful neutral party. They could work with anyone, trade with anyone, treat anyone, and in doing so they learned everyone's secrets. By the 1182nd, as Saladin's forces began to reclaim the Holy Land piece by piece, the writing was on the wall for the Crusader states. But while other Christian institutions panicked, the Hospitallers had been preparing for this moment for decades. They had already begun the process that would define their next phase of evolution, the systematic transfer of their most valuable assets, their most sensitive documents, and their most important personnel to secure locations beyond Saladin's reach. When Jerusalem finally fell in 1187, the Hospitallers didn't just retreat. They executed one of history's most sophisticated strategic withdrawals, preserving not just their material wealth, but their institutional knowledge and operational networks. While the Templars and other orders saw their power shattered by the loss of the Holy Land, the Hospitallers had already begun their transformation into something new, something that would prove far more dangerous than a simple military order could ever be. Because the fall of Jerusalem wasn't the end of the Hospitaller story, it was merely the end of the first chapter. What came next would test their adaptability, their cunning, and their willingness to embrace methods that would make their crusading ancestors weep with shame. The Hospitallers were about to become something unprecedented in medieval Europe, a stateless nation with its own navy, its own intelligence service, and its own foreign policy. They were about to discover that controlling territory was far less important than controlling information, money, and the men who wielded power in the shadows. They were about to become the prototype for every secret society, intelligence agency, and shadow organization that would follow in their wake. And they were just getting started. The ship cut through the Mediterranean darkness like a blade through silk, its black sails invisible against the star-drunk sky. No banners flew from its masts, no identifying marks adorned its hull. To any observer, it might have been a merchant vessel, or perhaps a pirate ship. In truth, it was something far more dangerous. A Hospitaller galley carrying secrets that could topple kingdoms. This was 1191, just 4 years after Saladin's conquest of Jerusalem, and the order was already demonstrating the adaptability that would define their survival for the next 8 centuries. While other Crusader institutions crumbled under the weight of defeat, the Hospitallers had done something remarkable. They had weaponized their displacement. You see, losing Jerusalem forced them to confront a fundamental truth that would reshape their entire approach to power. Territory, they realized, was a liability. Fortresses could be besieged, cities could be conquered, lands could be lost. But networks? Networks were immortal. Information was portable. Influence could be packed up and moved to wherever it would prove most profitable. The ship's destination was Cyprus, where Guy de Lusignan had established his precarious kingdom after losing his crown in Jerusalem. But the Hospitallers weren't coming as supplicants seeking refuge. They were coming as power brokers, carrying something far more valuable than gold. They possessed detailed intelligence on Saladin's military capabilities, his supply lines, his political vulnerabilities, and, most crucially, his plans for future campaigns. How had they acquired such sensitive information? Through the same hospital networks that everyone assumed were purely charitable. Muslim wounded had been treated in Hospitaller facilities. Saracen merchants had conducted business in Hospitaller trading posts. Islamic scholars had debated theology with Hospitaller intellectuals. Each interaction had been carefully catalogued, every conversation had been memorized, and every relationship had been cultivated with surgical precision. But the Cypriots weren't their only customers. That same intelligence was being sold, in carefully edited versions, to the Byzantine Empire, the Italian maritime republics, and even certain Muslim rulers who had their own reasons for wanting to understand Saladin's intentions. The Hospitallers had discovered something that modern intelligence agencies would later perfect. The same information could be monetized multiple times if you knew how to package it properly. This was the birth of what historians would later recognize as the first truly international intelligence marketplace. The Hospitallers weren't just gathering secrets anymore, they were creating a commodity market where information could be bought, sold, traded, and manipulated to serve their larger strategic objectives. And their objectives were becoming increasingly sophisticated. By 1192, Hospitaller agents were operating in courts from London to Constantinople, from Cairo to Kiev. They maintained safe houses in major commercial centers, operated their own communication networks, and had developed codes so complex that modern cryptographers still struggle to decipher some of their surviving documents. They weren't just an order of warrior monks anymore. They had become Europe's first multinational intelligence corporation. The genius of their approach lay in its deniability. When a Hospitaller brother negotiated a prisoner exchange, was he acting as a humanitarian or as an intelligence operative? When Hospitaller physicians treated foreign dignitaries, were they providing medical care or conducting espionage? When Hospitaller merchants facilitated trade agreements, were they promoting commerce or gathering economic intelligence? The answer, of course, was all of the above. The order had perfected the art of operating in the grey zones between legitimate and covert activities, between charity and espionage, between diplomacy and manipulation. Take their relationship with Richard the Lionheart during the Third Crusade. On the surface, the Hospitallers appeared to be loyal supporters of the English king's campaign. Their knights fought alongside his armies, their hospitals treated his wounded, their ships transported his supplies. But Hospitaller records, hidden in archives that wouldn't be opened for another 7 centuries, tell a different story. They were simultaneously negotiating secret agreements with Saladin's representatives, providing intelligence to Philip Augustus of France, and maintaining backdoor communications with the Byzantine Empire. When Richard's campaign ultimately failed to recapture Jerusalem, the Hospitallers were the only major crusading institution to actually increase their power and influence. Coincidence? Hardly. The pattern was becoming clear. The Hospitallers had evolved beyond the traditional medieval concept of loyalty to a single lord or cause. They had become something unprecedented, a transnational organization that served only its own institutional interests, using the language of religious devotion to mask activities that were purely pragmatic. This transformation accelerated dramatically when they established their new headquarters on the island of Rhodes in 1309. For the first time in their history, the Hospitallers weren't just influential, they were sovereign. They controlled their own territory, commanded their own navy, and answered to no earthly authority except the Pope, and even that relationship was becoming increasingly complex. Rhodes wasn't chosen randomly. Positioned at the crossroads of European, Asian, and African trade routes, the island was perfectly situated for the kind of operations the Hospitallers had in mind. They immediately began transforming it into something the medieval world had never seen before, a fortified intelligence hub that could project power across 3 continents while maintaining the facade of religious respectability. The harbour was expanded to accommodate the largest ships of the age. Fortifications were constructed using architectural innovations that wouldn't appear in mainland Europe for another century. Underground chambers were excavated for purposes that remain mysterious even today. And most significantly, a new class of Hospitaller emerged, the brother who had taken religious vows but whose primary duties involved activities that had nothing to do with charity or warfare. These shadow brothers operated under deep cover, often spending years establishing false identities in foreign courts. They posed as merchants, scholars, diplomats, even Islamic converts when necessary. Their existence was known only to the highest levels of the order's leadership, and their activities were so sensitive that they were never recorded in official documents. We know about them only because of a single surviving letter discovered in 1987 a sealed chamber beneath the palace of the Grand Masters in Rhodes. Written in a cipher that took decades to decode, it contained instructions for an operation so audacious that it defied belief: the systematic infiltration and manipulation of the Ottoman administrative system that was then emerging in Anatolia. The Hospitallers had identified the Ottomans as a rising threat long before anyone else took them seriously. While European courts dismissed them as just another Turkish tribe, Hospitaller intelligence networks had recognized their potential for expansion and had begun preparing countermeasures decades in advance. Their strategy was typically sophisticated. Rather than opposing Ottoman expansion directly, they sought to shape it, to channel it in directions that would serve Hospitaller interests. They placed agents within Ottoman administrative structures, influenced Ottoman military planning, and even helped finance certain Ottoman campaigns while secretly supporting their opponents. The goal wasn't to destroy the Ottoman Empire. That would have been impossible. The goal was to ensure that as the Ottomans grew stronger, they would become increasingly dependent on Hospitaller expertise, Hospitaller financing, and Hospitaller intelligence networks. It was a long-term strategy that would take centuries to fully implement, but the Hospitallers had always thought in terms of generations rather than years. And it was working. By the early 14th century, Ottoman officials were regularly consulting with Hospitaller merchants on matters of trade and taxation. Ottoman military commanders were using maps provided by Hospitaller pilgrims. Ottoman administrators were relying on financial instruments developed by Hospitaller banking networks. The rising empire was being shaped by the very organization that, on the surface, appeared to be its natural enemy. But the Ottomans weren't the only ones being manipulated. The Hospitallers were simultaneously running similar operations against the Byzantine Empire, the Italian city-states, the Mamluk Sultanate, and even the emerging kingdoms of Eastern Europe. They had become puppet masters on a scale that wouldn't be seen again until the rise of modern intelligence agencies. The key to their success lay in something that their contemporaries completely failed to understand. The Hospitallers had transcended the medieval world's binary thinking about friend and enemy, Christian and Muslim, ally and opponent. They operated in a realm of pure strategic calculation, where the only constant was their own institutional survival and growth. This flexibility allowed them to adapt to changing circumstances with a speed that left their competitors bewildered. When the balance of power shifted, the Hospitallers shifted with it. When new opportunities emerged, they were already positioned to exploit them. When threats materialized, they had already developed contingency plans. It was this adaptability that would allow them to survive the coming storm that would destroy so many other medieval institutions. Because by the early 14th century, the world was changing in ways that would test every assumption about power, religion, and loyalty. The age of the Crusades was ending. The age of nation-states was beginning. And the Hospitallers were about to demonstrate once again that they could reinvent themselves to thrive in any environment, no matter how hostile or unfamiliar. The question wasn't whether they would survive the transformation. The question was what they would become in the process, and whether anyone would recognize them when they emerged from their cocoon of secrecy, ready to spread their wings in a world that had no idea what was coming. The metamorphosis was about to begin, and it would be more dramatic than anyone could have imagined. The morning sun cast long shadows across the courtyard of the palace of the Grand Masters, as Brother Antoine de Villaret sealed the last of 3 identical letters. Each bore the same wax seal, each contained the same coded message, but each was destined for a different corner of Europe. One would travel north to the Hanseatic League, another west to the courts of France, and the third east to the merchant princes of Venice. The message was simple. The game was changing, and the Hospitallers were ready to change with it. It was 1315, and something unprecedented was happening across medieval Europe. The old certainties were cracking. The papal authority that had dominated politics for centuries was fracturing under the weight of the Avignon captivity. The Holy Roman Empire was dissolving into a patchwork of competing principalities. The feudal system that had governed society for generations was being challenged by the rise of merchant classes and urban centers. Most institutions saw this chaos as a crisis. The Hospitallers saw it as the greatest opportunity in their 3-century history. While other medieval powers struggled to maintain their traditional roles in a rapidly changing world, the Hospitallers had already begun their most audacious transformation yet. They weren't just adapting to the new reality, they were actively engineering it. Through a network of operations so complex that modern historians are still trying to map its full extent, they were systematically undermining the old order while positioning themselves as indispensable architects of whatever would replace it. The first phase of their strategy focused on what they called financial architecture, a concept that wouldn't be fully understood by mainstream economists for another 4 centuries. The Hospitallers had recognized that in an increasingly interconnected world, whoever controlled the flow of money would ultimately control everything else, and they were determined to be those controllers. Their banking operations had evolved far beyond the simple money transfers that had served crusading armies. By the early 14th century, Hospitaller financial networks stretched from the wool markets of England to the spice routes of the Indian Ocean. They weren't just moving money anymore, they were creating it, manipulating it, and using it as a weapon more deadly than any sword. Consider their operations in the grain markets of northern Italy. On the surface, the Hospitallers appeared to be engaged in straightforward commodity trading, buying surplus grain in good years and selling it during famines. But their surviving account books reveal something far more sophisticated, a systematic campaign to destabilize regional economies through carefully orchestrated market manipulations. When the harvests failed in Lombardy in 1317, it wasn't just bad weather that caused the subsequent famine. Hospitaller agents had been quietly purchasing and hoarding grain supplies for months in advance, creating artificial scarcity that drove prices to astronomical levels. The resulting social unrest toppled 3 local governments and created power vacuums that the Hospitallers were perfectly positioned to fill through their network of allied merchant families. But the grain manipulation was just one thread in a tapestry of operations that spanned the continent. In the silver mines of Bohemia, Hospitaller pilgrims were secretly assessing extraction capabilities and identifying the most profitable veins. In the textile workshops of Flanders, Hospitaller merchants were gathering intelligence on new production techniques, while simultaneously recruiting skilled artisans for relocation to Rhodes. In the universities of Paris and Oxford, Hospitaller scholars were not just studying theology, but developing new methods of encryption, navigation, and metallurgy. Each operation was compartmentalized. Each agent knew only what they needed to know, and each success was carefully concealed to avoid attracting unwanted attention. The Hospitallers had learned from watching the downfall of the Templars that visibility was dangerous. Power was most effective when it remained invisible. The destruction of the Knights Templar in 1307 had provided the Hospitallers with a masterclass in what not to do. The Templars had grown too proud, too obvious, too threatening to established power structures. They had forgotten the first rule of shadow organizations. Never let your enemies realize how powerful you've become until it's too late for them to do anything about it. So while the Templars burned at the stake, and their order was dissolved in spectacular fashion, the Hospitallers quietly absorbed many of their assets, recruited their surviving members, and studied their mistakes with the cold precision of military strategists. They wouldn't make the same errors. Instead, they perfected the art of misdirection. When European nobles looked at the Hospitallers, they saw exactly what the order wanted them to see: a religious institution dedicated to charity and the defense of Christendom. When Muslim rulers observed their activities, they perceived a potential ally in their struggles against common enemies. When merchants dealt with them, they encountered sophisticated business partners who understood the complexities of international trade. None of these perceptions were false exactly, but none of them revealed the full truth either. The Hospitallers had become a hall of mirrors where every observer saw a different reflection, and no one saw the complete picture except those at the very apex of the order's hierarchy. This compartmentalization extended even to their own members. The majority of Hospitaller Knights remained genuinely devoted to their traditional missions of warfare and charity. They fought bravely in defense of Rhodes, tended carefully to pilgrims and the sick, and lived according to their religious vows with sincere conviction. They were the order's public face, and their authentic dedication provided perfect cover for activities they knew nothing about. Above them operated a smaller circle of brothers who understood that the order's mission had expanded beyond its original parameters, but who still believed they were serving a fundamentally religious purpose. These men managed the day-to-day operations of the intelligence networks, the banking systems, and the diplomatic relationships that kept the order functioning in an increasingly hostile world. And at the very top, accessible only to a handful of individuals whose names were never recorded in any official document, was the true command structure. These shadow masters understood what the Hospitallers had really become, not a religious order that happened to be effective at worldly affairs, but a power-seeking organization that used religious identity as camouflage for activities that would have horrified their founders. They called themselves the Inner Circle, though even that name appears in only a few encrypted documents that survived the centuries. Their meetings left no minutes, their decisions generated no official records, and their very existence was denied by every other level of the organization. Yet their influence shaped every major policy decision, every strategic initiative, and every operational priority of the order for the next 2 centuries. It was the Inner Circle that made the decision to abandon the Holy Land permanently in favor of building a Mediterranean empire. It was the Inner Circle that authorized the systematic infiltration of European royal courts. It was the Inner Circle that approved the development of technologies that gave the Hospitallers decisive advantages over their competitors. And it was the Inner Circle that would ultimately guide the order through the most dangerous period in its history, when the forces they had helped unleash would threaten to destroy everything they had built. Because by the 1322nd, the Hospitallers' manipulation of European politics was beginning to generate unintended consequences. The destabilization campaigns that had served their short-term interests were creating long-term problems that even their sophisticated planning had not anticipated. The financial instruments they had developed were being copied and improved by competitors. The intelligence networks they had established were being penetrated by rival organizations. Most dangerously, certain European rulers were beginning to recognize patterns in the chaos that had been consuming their continent. They were starting to ask uncomfortable questions about why the Hospitallers always seemed to emerge stronger from every crisis, why their trading networks were so remarkably efficient, and why their diplomatic relationships were so mysteriously productive. The order that had survived by remaining invisible was slowly becoming visible, and visibility, as the Templars had learned, was the first step toward destruction. The game was about to change again, and this time the Hospitallers might not be the ones controlling the rules. In the harbor of Rhodes, ships were being loaded with more than just cargo. Documents were being sealed, agents were receiving new identities, and contingency plans that had been years in the making were finally being activated. The Hospitallers had always been masters of transformation, but they were about to face their greatest test yet. The question wasn't whether they could adapt to survive. The question was whether anything recognizable would remain when the adaptation was complete. And in the shadows of the Inner Circle, men who had spent their lives manipulating the fate of nations were beginning to wonder if they had created forces beyond their ability to control. The age of medieval warfare was ending. The age of information warfare was about to begin, and the Hospitallers were about to discover whether their centuries of preparation had been enough to master a game whose rules were still being written. The coded message arrived on a Tuesday morning in March 1324, carried by a merchant who dealt in silk and secrets in equal measure. Brother Guillaume de Clermont broke the seal with hands that had learned to remain steady, even when the contents promised to reshape the world. The intelligence was devastating in its simplicity. Pope John XXII was preparing to launch an investigation into Hospitaller finances. But this wasn't just any papal inquiry. The Pope had recruited a team of Franciscan accountants known for their mathematical precision and their complete incorruptibility. These weren't the usual church bureaucrats who could be bought with gold or intimidated with threats. These were men who treated numbers like sacred texts and viewed financial irregularities as personal affronts to divine order. If they were allowed to examine the true scope of Hospitaller operations, they would uncover banking networks that violated every principle of canon law, trading relationships that crossed religious boundaries in ways that bordered on heretical and financial instruments so sophisticated that they wouldn't be reinvented until the Renaissance. The investigation would destroy more than just the order's reputation. It would reveal the existence of economic systems that weren't supposed to exist for another 2 centuries. The inner circle had 48 hours to make a decision that would define their survival. They could submit to the investigation and hope their carefully constructed facades would hold under scrutiny. They could attempt to eliminate the threat through the methods they had perfected over decades of covert operations. Or they could do something unprecedented in their 3-century history. They could disappear entirely and rebuild themselves from nothing. The debate that followed would later be remembered as the 48-Hour Council, though no official record of it exists in any archive. 7 men gathered in a chamber beneath the Palace of the Grand Masters, a room so thoroughly shielded from observation that its very existence was known only to those who met there. They represented the accumulated wisdom of generations of shadow masters, men who had learned to think in terms of centuries while acting with the precision of assassins. Brother de Clermont, despite his youth, spoke first. His analysis was characteristically brutal in its clarity. The papal investigation was merely the visible symptom of a deeper problem. European rulers were beginning to coordinate their intelligence gathering in ways that threatened all covert organizations. The Hospitallers' manipulation of grain markets had created patterns that mathematical minds could detect. Their banking operations had grown so extensive that they were beginning to influence currency exchange rates in ways that demanded explanation. Most dangerously, their success had bred imitators. Italian merchant families were creating their own international networks. German trading guilds were developing their own intelligence capabilities. Even certain monastic orders were beginning to engage in activities that blurred the line between spiritual and temporal power. The Hospitallers' monopoly on sophisticated covert operations was ending, and their competitive advantages were being eroded by organizations that had learned from their example. Brother Marchand, whose network of agents stretched from Novgorod to Cairo, disagreed with the assessment but not the conclusion. The problem wasn't that they had become too visible, it was that they hadn't become invisible enough. The order still maintained too many traditional structures, too many conventional relationships, too many predictable patterns. They needed to evolve beyond recognition, to become something that their enemies couldn't identify even when they were looking directly at it. The solution he proposed was radical, even by Hospitaller standards. They would maintain their public identity as a military religious order while secretly fragmenting their actual operations into dozens of seemingly unrelated organizations. Trading companies, scholarly societies, charitable foundations, diplomatic missions, each would appear to be independent while actually serving as components of a distributed intelligence network that could never be destroyed because it could never be fully mapped. Brother Vaudemont, the Order's master of financial architecture, pushed the concept even further. Why stop at fragmenting their operations? Why not fragment themselves? The traditional model of a centralized organization was becoming obsolete in a world where information traveled faster than authority could respond. Instead of maintaining a single command structure that could be targeted and destroyed, they should create multiple autonomous cells that could operate independently while sharing resources and intelligence through carefully concealed channels. Each cell would have its own cover identity, its own operational parameters, and its own geographical sphere of influence. They would appear to be competitors, even enemies, while actually serving a coordinated strategic vision that only the inner circle would fully understand. If one cell was discovered and destroyed, the others would continue operating without interruption. If the traditional Hospitaller order was dissolved, the distributed network would survive and eventually reconstitute itself under new identities. The implications were staggering. They weren't just talking about reforming their organization, they were talking about creating a new form of power that could survive any attempt at destruction because it would exist simultaneously everywhere and nowhere. It would be like trying to kill smoke or arrest a shadow. Brother Sancerre, whose specialty was long-term strategic planning, raised the crucial question that none of them wanted to confront. If they fragmented their operations and identities to this degree, how could they ensure that the fragments would remain loyal to their original mission? How could they prevent the autonomous cells from becoming genuinely independent and pursuing their own agendas? How could they maintain unity of purpose across an organization that would no longer have any visible unity at all? The answer came from an unexpected source. Brother Aldrich, the youngest member of the inner circle and the most recent addition to their ranks, had been silent throughout the debate. When he finally spoke, his words carried the weight of revelation. The solution wasn't to maintain loyalty through traditional hierarchical control. It was to embed loyalty so deeply into the operational structure that it would become invisible even to those who carried it. They would create what he called genetic loyalty, a system of training, indoctrination, and psychological conditioning so sophisticated that agents would serve the Order's interests even when they believed they were serving someone else. Each cell would recruit and train its personnel using methods that would implant Hospitaller values and objectives at a subconscious level. The operatives would think they were working for merchant guilds or scholarly societies or charitable foundations, but their decision-making processes would be shaped by principles that served the Order's ultimate goals. It was a concept so advanced that it wouldn't be fully understood by intelligence theorists for another 6 centuries. They were proposing to create sleeper agents who didn't know they were sleeper agents, distributed networks that would serve centralized objectives without realizing they were part of a larger organization, and loyalty systems that would function through psychological programming rather than conscious commitment. The debate continued through the night and into the following day. Maps were consulted, cipher keys were generated, and contingency plans were drafted with the obsessive attention to detail that had characterized Hospitaller operations for 3 centuries. By the time the sun set on the second day, the decision had been made. The Knights Hospitaller, as the world knew them, would submit to the papal investigation and emerge with their reputation intact, but their power seemingly diminished. Certain operations would be discontinued, certain agents would be recalled, and certain financial instruments would be abandoned. To outside observers, it would appear that the Order had been chastened by papal scrutiny and had returned to its original charitable mission. In reality, They would be implementing the most sophisticated transformation in the history of covert organizations. Over the following months, Hospitaller assets, personnel, and operational capabilities would be systematically redistributed among dozens of apparently independent organizations across Europe and the Mediterranean. The Order's intelligence networks would fragment into trading companies, scholarly societies, and religious foundations. Their financial operations would be absorbed by merchant banks, craft guilds, and charitable institutions. Their military capabilities would be transferred to mercenary companies, shipping consortiums, and private security organizations. Each fragment would appear to be a legitimate business or institutional entity with its own history, its own objectives, and its own reasons for existing. But beneath the surface, invisible threads would connect them all in a web of mutual support and shared purpose that would be impossible for outsiders to detect. The transformation would take years to complete and decades to perfect. But when it was finished, the world would face something it had never seen before, a distributed intelligence network that could influence events across continents while leaving no trace of its existence, no evidence of coordination, and no target for retaliation. They would become the prototype for every secret society, intelligence agency, and shadow organization that would follow in their wake. They would demonstrate that true power didn't require visibility, that effective control didn't need official authority, and that the most dangerous enemies were often the ones who appeared to be allies. The medieval world was ending, and the Hospitallers were about to help birth something entirely new. They had survived the fall of Jerusalem by adapting to displacement. They had thrived during the chaos of the 14th century by manipulating instability. Now they would transcend the limitations of traditional organization itself by becoming something that existed beyond the reach of conventional power structures. The greatest magic trick in history was about to begin, and when it was complete, the magicians would have vanished so thoroughly that future generations would debate whether they had ever existed at all. But the trick would continue working long after the last witness had forgotten what they had seen. The first signs of success came from the most unlikely source, a grain merchant in Bruges who had never heard of the Knights Hospitaller, but whose business practices bore their invisible fingerprints. It was 1329, 5 years after the 48-hour council, and Brother Thomas of Strasbourg stood in the shadows of a cathedral watching a miracle of misdirection unfold before his eyes. The merchant, Willem van den Berg, was negotiating a complex trade agreement that would move Flemish wheat through Italian ports to buyers in the eastern Mediterranean. The terms were sophisticated, the financing mechanisms were innovative, and the risk management strategies were decades ahead of their time. Van den Berg had no idea that his business partner was a former Hospitaller agent, that his banking connections had been carefully cultivated by order operatives, or that his most profitable trade routes had been developed through intelligence networks that stretched back to the Crusades. He believed he was a self-made entrepreneur who had succeeded through cleverness and hard work. In reality, he was a perfectly programmed instrument of Hospitaller economic strategy. This was the genius of the new system. Van den Berg wasn't pretending to be independent, he genuinely was independent. His loyalty to Hospitaller objectives had been embedded so deeply into his training and worldview that it operated below the level of conscious thought. He made decisions that served the Order's interests because he had been conditioned to believe that those decisions were simply good business practice. The conditioning hadn't been accomplished through mystical mind control or supernatural manipulation. It had been achieved through something far more mundane but infinitely more effective: education. Van den Berg had learned his trade through a network of commercial schools and merchant guilds that appeared to be competing institutions but were actually components of a single educational system designed to produce business leaders who thought like Hospitallers without knowing they were doing so. The curriculum was brilliant in its subtlety. Students learned mathematics from texts that embedded Hospitaler financial principles into seemingly neutral equations. They studied geography from maps that emphasized trade routes controlled by order-affiliated merchants. They practiced negotiation through case studies that reinforced Hospitaler approaches to risk assessment and conflict resolution. They absorbed business ethics from moral philosophy that had been carefully edited to promote behaviors that served the order's strategic objectives. By the time they graduated, these students had been programmed to see the world through Hospitaler eyes, to value what the order valued, and to pursue goals that aligned with the order's mission. They weren't conscious agents, they were unconscious assets, and they were far more valuable than any spy could ever be. The educational network itself had been constructed with the same attention to invisibility that characterized all post-transformation Hospitaler operations. The schools appeared to be funded by local merchant associations, craft guilds, and religious foundations. Their teachers seemed to be independent scholars, successful traders, and reformed clerics. Their students came from diverse backgrounds and pursued seemingly unrelated careers after graduation. But beneath this facade of diversity and independence lay a coordinated system that was producing a new class of European business leaders who shared common values, common methodologies, and common objectives without realizing they had been trained to do so. They competed with each other in their individual markets while unconsciously collaborating to advance a larger strategy that none of them fully understood. The transformation had succeeded beyond the inner circle's most optimistic projections. Within a decade of its implementation, Hospitaler influence had not only been preserved, but had actually expanded into sectors and regions where the traditional order had never operated. Their financial networks now extended into the emerging banking centers of northern Italy and the Hanseatic League. Their intelligence capabilities had penetrated the royal courts of France and England. Their trading operations had established footholds in markets from the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea. Most remarkably, they had achieved this expansion while becoming virtually invisible to their enemies. The papal investigation had concluded that the Hospitallers had reformed their practices and returned to their original charitable mission. European rulers who had once viewed the order with suspicion now saw them as useful but ultimately harmless allies. Even their traditional enemies in the Islamic world had begun to regard them as potential partners in mutually beneficial commercial relationships. The order had successfully convinced the world that it had become smaller, weaker, and less ambitious, at precisely the moment when it was actually becoming larger, stronger, and more influential than ever before. But success brought new challenges that the inner circle had not fully anticipated. The distributed network was generating so much wealth and intelligence that it was becoming difficult to manage through traditional methods. The autonomous cells were developing their own internal cultures and operational preferences that sometimes conflicted with central strategic objectives. Most dangerously, some of the unconscious assets were beginning to achieve levels of success and influence that threatened to make them visible to the same intelligence networks that had once hunted the Hospitallers themselves. Brother Thomas had been dispatched to Bruges not just to observe Vandenberg's operations, but to assess whether the merchant had become too successful for the order's safety. If Vandenberg's business empire continued to grow at its current rate, it would inevitably attract the attention of rival intelligence networks, royal tax collectors, and ambitious nobles, who might investigate its origins too thoroughly. The very success of the Hospitaler conditioning might force them to eliminate one of their most valuable assets. It was a problem they had never faced before: how to manage success without destroying the systems that had created it. In the old days, they could simply relocate threatened operations or eliminate dangerous individuals through direct action. But the new distributed network was too complex and too interconnected to be managed through such crude methods. Each component was linked to dozens of others through relationships that had been carefully constructed over years or even decades. Removing a single element could trigger cascading failures that might expose the entire structure. The solution, when it came, demonstrated once again the Hospitalers' genius for turning apparent weaknesses into sources of strength. Instead of trying to limit the success of their unconscious assets, they would create systems to manage and redirect that success in ways that served their larger objectives while maintaining operational security. They called it success cycling, and it would become one of their most sophisticated innovations. Rather than allowing any single asset to become too prominent, they would systematically rotate successful individuals through different roles, different markets, and different identities. A merchant who became too wealthy would be encouraged to invest in new ventures that would distribute his assets among multiple cells. A scholar who gained too much influence would be offered opportunities to travel and teach, spreading his knowledge while reducing his concentration of power. A craftsman whose innovations threatened to revolutionize his industry would be provided with partners and apprentices who would ensure that the benefits of his discoveries were shared among order-affiliated networks. The cycling process would be managed through the same educational and social networks that had created the unconscious assets in the first place. Successful individuals would be offered opportunities that appeared to be natural career advancement, but were actually strategic repositioning designed to maintain the balance of the larger system. They would believe they were making independent choices, while actually following paths that had been carefully prepared for them. Most brilliantly, the cycling would create the appearance of natural economic dynamism, while actually serving to strengthen Hospitaller control over European commerce. Markets that seemed to be characterized by healthy competition would actually be dominated by networks of unconscious assets who had been trained to think in compatible ways. Industries that appeared to be driven by innovation and entrepreneurship would actually be guided by coordinated strategies that served long-term Hospitaller objectives. The transformation was entering its second phase, and the results were beginning to reshape the economic landscape of medieval Europe in ways that would not be fully understood for centuries. The Hospitallers had not just survived the transition from the medieval to the early modern world, they had engineered that transition to serve their own purposes while remaining completely invisible to the forces they were manipulating. They had become something unprecedented in human history, a distributed intelligence network that could influence the development of entire civilizations while leaving no trace of its existence. They were the invisible hand that guided market forces, the unseen architect of political alliances, and the secret author of cultural changes that appeared to be natural evolutionary processes. And they were just getting started. The techniques they had developed for managing unconscious assets and cycling success would be refined and expanded over the following centuries. The educational networks that produced business leaders who thought like Hospitallers would evolve into university systems that shaped the intellectual development of entire societies. The financial instruments they had created to move wealth invisibly would become the foundation of international banking systems that would dominate global commerce. The medieval world had ended not with the collapse of feudalism or the rise of nation-states, but with the birth of something that transcended both, a form of organized power that could exist simultaneously within and beyond any political system, that could adapt to any economic structure, and that could survive any attempt at destruction, because it had learned to hide not just its activities, but its very existence. The greatest magic trick in history was complete, and the magicians had vanished so thoroughly that future generations would never even know they had been watching a performance. But the trick would continue working, shaping events and influencing outcomes, long after the last witness had forgotten there had ever been anything to see. In the shadows of Bruges Cathedral, Brother Thomas smiled and began composing his report to the inner circle. The network was functioning perfectly, the assets were performing beyond expectations, and the world remained blissfully unaware that it was dancing to music composed by ghosts. The Hospitallers had achieved immortality not through mystical transformation, but through strategic invisibility. They had learned that the most effective way to control the future was to become indistinguishable from it. And in the centuries to come, as kings rose and fell, as empires expanded and collapsed, as religions evolved and ideologies transformed, the invisible network would continue its patient work, guiding humanity toward destinations that it had chosen but would never reveal. The hidden chronicles were being written in invisible ink, and only those who knew the secret of reading between the lines would ever understand what had really happened in the shadows of history. The year was 1347, and death was walking across Europe with methodical precision. The Black Death had arrived, and with it came the greatest test of the Hospitaller transformation. As cities emptied and kingdoms crumbled under the weight of plague, as trade routes collapsed and social orders dissolved into chaos, the distributed network faced its first existential crisis. But where others saw catastrophe, the inner circle recognized opportunity on a scale that defied comprehension. Brother Marcus of Avignon stood in the abandoned scriptorium of what had once been a thriving monastery, watching as his carefully selected team catalogued the intellectual treasures of a dying civilization. Ancient texts on mathematics, medicine, philosophy, and natural sciences lay scattered across wooden tables like precious stones waiting to be harvested. The plague had killed the monks who had guarded these manuscripts for centuries, but their knowledge would not die with them. This scene was being repeated in dozens of locations across the continent. Wherever the plague struck, wherever institutions collapsed, wherever libraries were abandoned, Hospitaller agents appeared like shadows to preserve what others were too terrified to touch. They moved through infected cities with the confidence of men who understood that knowledge was more valuable than gold, and that temporary chaos created permanent advantages for those bold enough to seize them. The plague hadn't caught them unprepared. Hospitaller intelligence networks had been tracking its westward movement for months, and the inner circle had developed contingency plans that would have seemed impossibly prescient to anyone who didn't understand the sophistication of their information gathering. While European rulers were still debating whether the pestilence was divine punishment or natural disaster, the Hospitallers were already implementing strategies to exploit the social and economic disruptions that would inevitably follow. Their response revealed the true genius of the distributed network model. Instead of trying to protect their assets from the plague's effects, they had positioned themselves to benefit from them. The autonomous cells that had been established in major commercial centers weren't just continuing to operate despite the chaos, they were expanding their influence as their competitors succumbed to disease and despair. Take the situation in Venice, where the plague had killed nearly half the population and brought the Republic's vaunted commercial empire to the brink of collapse. The Doge and his council were focused purely on survival, implementing desperate measures to maintain basic civic functions while the city's trading networks withered. But in the abandoned warehouses of the Rialto, a seemingly independent consortium of Greek merchants was quietly acquiring the contracts, routes, and relationships that had once belonged to the greatest commercial families of the Mediterranean. These merchants appeared to be refugees from Constantinople, survivors of Byzantine political upheavals who had arrived in Venice just before the plague struck. They spoke Greek among themselves, practiced orthodox religious rites, and maintained cultural traditions that seemed to mark them as genuine Eastern Christians. Their leader, a man calling himself Dimitrios Palaiologos, claimed descent from the imperial family and possessed documents that appeared to authenticate his noble lineage. In reality, Paleologos was Brother Andreas of Crete, a Hospitaller operative who had spent 15 years perfecting his Greek identity in preparation for exactly this kind of opportunity. His merchant consortium was an entirely artificial creation, staffed by agents who had been trained in Byzantine cultural practices and equipped with forged genealogies that would withstand any reasonable scrutiny. The documents proving their noble connections had been manufactured in Hospitaller scriptoriums using techniques so sophisticated that they were indistinguishable from authentic Byzantine chancellery productions. But the deception went far deeper than false identities and forged papers. The consortium's business practices, while appearing to follow Greek commercial traditions, were actually implementing Hospitaller financial strategies that had been adapted to exploit the specific vulnerabilities created by the plague. They offered credit to desperate Venetian merchants at rates that seemed generous compared to the usurious terms being demanded by local moneylenders. They provided insurance for commercial ventures when other underwriters had withdrawn from the market entirely. They facilitated trade relationships with Eastern markets that had been disrupted by the political chaos following the plague. Each service was designed to create dependency while generating intelligence. Merchants who borrowed from the consortium found themselves gradually drawn into business relationships that served Hospitaller strategic objectives. Traders who accepted their insurance discovered that the most profitable opportunities were those that aligned with the consortium's broader commercial interests. Nobles who engaged their diplomatic services learned to rely on their advice for navigating the complex political landscape of plague-ravaged Europe. Within 2 years, the consortium had become indispensable to Venice's economic recovery. They weren't just participating in the Republic's commercial renaissance, they were quietly directing it, channeling the city's renewed prosperity into patterns that served the distributed network's long-term objectives. And they had accomplished this while appearing to be nothing more than successful foreign merchants who had been fortunate enough to arrive at the right moment with the right resources. The Venetian operation was just one thread in a tapestry of exploitation that spanned the continent. In Paris, a group of Jewish moneylenders who had supposedly fled persecution in Germany were establishing banking relationships with the French nobility. In London, Flemish wool merchants who claimed to be refugees from plague-devastated Bruges were negotiating exclusive contracts with English textile producers. In Prague, Italian scholars who appeared to be seeking patronage after losing their positions in plague-emptied universities were being welcomed into the court of the Holy Roman Emperor. Each group seemed to be exactly what they claimed to be, and each was actually a Hospitaller cell, implementing carefully prepared strategies to exploit the opportunities created by social disruption. The plague hadn't weakened the distributed network, it had provided the perfect cover for the most aggressive expansion in the Order's history. But the expansion went beyond simple commercial opportunism. The Hospitallers were systematically harvesting the intellectual capital of a civilization in crisis, preserving knowledge that would otherwise be lost, while simultaneously positioning themselves as the custodians of European learning. The manuscripts they collected from abandoned monasteries, the scholars they recruited from disbanded universities, the artisans they relocated from depopulated workshops, all were being integrated into a knowledge preservation and development system that would give them decisive advantages over any potential competitors. They had recognized what European rulers were too traumatized to understand. The plague wasn't just a temporary crisis, but a civilizational watershed that would reshape the balance of power for generations to come. The old certainties were dying along with the old elites, and whatever emerged from the chaos would be defined by those who had been wise enough to prepare for transformation, rather than simply trying to survive it. The Inner Circle's strategy was characteristically long-term in its vision. They weren't just exploiting immediate opportunities, they were positioning the distributed network to dominate the post-plague world before that world had even finished taking shape. The knowledge they preserved would become the foundation of new technologies. The relationships they cultivated would evolve into political alliances. The economic networks they established would grow into commercial empires that would define European prosperity for centuries to come. Most brilliantly, they were accomplishing this transformation while actually strengthening their invisibility rather than compromising it. The chaos of the plague years provided perfect cover for activities that would have attracted suspicion in more stable times. The desperate need for expertise, capital, and stability made European leaders eager to accept help from any source without asking too many questions about origins or motivations. The breakdown of traditional social structures created opportunities for advancement that wouldn't have existed under normal circumstances. By 1351, as the worst effects of the plague began to subside, the Hospitallers had fundamentally altered their position in European society. They were no longer just a shadow network, operating on the margins of power. They had become integral to the functioning of the continent's economic and intellectual systems. Their agents weren't just embedded in important institutions, they were often the people keeping those institutions operational when traditional leadership had been decimated by disease and social upheaval. The transformation was so complete that even the Inner Circle was sometimes amazed by its success. They had gambled everything on the theory that distributed networks could adapt to crisis more effectively than centralized organizations, and the plague had vindicated their strategy beyond their wildest projections. They had not just survived the greatest catastrophe in European history, they had used it to achieve a level of influence that would have been impossible under normal circumstances. But success on this scale inevitably created new challenges. The distributed network was becoming so large and so influential that it was beginning to generate its own internal dynamics that were difficult to control from any central authority. The autonomous cells were developing their own interests and priorities that didn't always align with the Inner Circle's strategic vision. The unconscious assets were achieving levels of prominence that threatened to attract the kind of scrutiny that could expose the entire system. Most dangerously, the rapid expansion was creating points of contact between different components of the network that could potentially reveal patterns that would compromise their invisibility. A Hospitaller agent, operating under Greek identity in Venice, might encounter another agent working under Jewish identity in Paris, and even the most carefully maintained false personas might not survive close examination by someone trained to detect deception. The Inner Circle faced a new version of the success management problem they had encountered in Bruges, but on a continental scale. They needed to maintain coordination among dozens of autonomous cells while preventing any single observer from recognizing the connections that linked them together. They required methods of communication and control that could function across the complex network without creating vulnerabilities that enemies could exploit. The solution they developed would become their most sophisticated innovation yet, and it would serve as the template for intelligence operations for centuries to come. They called it layered autonomy, and it represented a revolutionary approach to managing distributed organizations that wouldn't be fully understood by organizational theorists until the computer age. Instead of trying to control the network through direct command relationships, they would manage it through what they termed environmental programming. Each cell would operate with complete autonomy within its local sphere of influence, making decisions based on its own assessment of opportunities and threats. But the environment within which those decisions were made would be carefully shaped through the systematic distribution of information, resources, and incentives that would guide autonomous actors toward choices that served the larger strategic vision. The genius of the system lay in its psychological sophistication. The cells would believe they were making independent decisions based on their own analysis of local conditions, but their decision-making processes would be influenced by intelligence that had been filtered and interpreted to support predetermined conclusions. They would compete with each other for resources and opportunities, but the competition would take place within frameworks that ensured all outcomes served the network's broader objectives. Most importantly, no single component of the system would possess enough information to understand how it functioned as a whole. Each cell would know only what it needed to know to perform its assigned functions, and even the inner circle would interact with the network through intermediary structures that prevented direct contact between central command and operational elements. It was a system so advanced that it would have seemed like magic to contemporary observers, and indeed, some of the techniques they developed would later be attributed to supernatural influence by historians who couldn't conceive of purely human organizations achieving such sophisticated coordination. They had created something that existed simultaneously everywhere and nowhere, that could influence events across continents while leaving no trace of coordination, and that could adapt to changing circumstances without requiring centralized control. The plague had been their chrysalis, and they had emerged from it transformed into something that transcended every previous model of organized power. They weren't just invisible anymore, they had become indistinguishable from the natural forces that shaped human civilization. And in the decades to come, as Europe recovered from the devastation and began to rebuild itself into something new, the hidden hand of the Hospitallers would guide every major development, while remaining completely undetected by the forces it was manipulating. The greatest magic trick in history was entering its final phase, and when it was complete, the distinction between the magicians and the world they had transformed would have vanished entirely. But the magic would continue working, shaping the future according to designs that had been conceived in the shadows and implemented through methods that would never be fully understood by those who lived under their influence. And so we reach the end of our journey through the hidden Chronicles, but perhaps end is the wrong word. Because if there's one thing we've learned about the Knights Hospitaller, it's that endings are just new beginnings in disguise. From the blood-soaked streets of Jerusalem to the plague-ravaged cities of medieval Europe, we've traced the evolution of an organization that mastered the ultimate paradox: how to become more powerful by becoming invisible, how to control everything by appearing to control nothing. They didn't just adapt to changing times, they engineered those changes while convincing the world they were merely passive observers. The Hospitallers understood something that modern intelligence agencies are still trying to perfect. True power doesn't announce itself. It doesn't need monuments or parades or history books. It operates through influence so subtle that its targets never realize they're being guided, through networks so distributed that they can never be mapped, and through strategies so long-term that they outlive the civilizations they were designed to shape. But here's the most unsettling thought of all. If they could achieve this level of sophisticated control 8 centuries ago, using nothing but human intelligence, carefully crafted education, and patient manipulation of economic forces, what might they have become in our modern age of global communications, digital surveillance, and algorithmic influence? The next time you wonder why certain decisions seem to benefit the same shadowy interests regardless of who's officially in charge, the next time you notice patterns in global events that feel too coordinated to be coincidental, remember the lesson of the Hospitallers. Sometimes the most powerful forces in the world are the ones you never see coming. The Chronicles may be hidden, but they're still being written. The question isn't whether secret networks shape our reality, it's whether we're wise enough to recognize their fingerprints when we see them. Sweet dreams.